17-year-old Caleb Turner thought chasing a stray calf into the Kansas woods was nothing more than bad luck. But beneath the moonlight, he stumbled into a clearing where something older than memory waited, taller than a man, ember-eyed, and speaking in a voice like stone dragged across stone. It warned him debts were owed, boundaries broken, and fire would come. When railroad men arrived with axes and papers, the warning proved true. Caleb was left standing between his father's stubborn will, a town on edge, and a creature that demanded balance, or blood. The summer sun hung low over the rolling plains, spilling golden light across endless fields of tall grass that whispered and swayed in the evening breeze. 17-year-old Caleb Turner wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his sleeve, his straw hat tilted just enough to shield his pale blue eyes. His father's farm stretched wide across the Kansas frontier, a patch of stubborn land carved out of the prairie with years of grit, calloused hands, and prayers for rain. Caleb had been born there, raised on hard work and the quiet kind of hope only farm folk understood. Every day brought the same rhythm: mornings of milking, afternoons of mending fences, evenings spent listening for coyotes and counting the herd before dusk settled in like a heavy quilt. That night, though, the rhythm broke. Caleb had just finished stacking the last of the hay when a sharp bleat cut across the field. His head snapped up, and his heart sank. One of the calves, a tan-speckled yearling, barely old enough to graze alone, had slipped through a gap in the fence near the edge of the property. Its small body darted toward the tree line, the woods beyond the pasture dark and unwelcoming. Caleb cursed under his breath. His father, Samuel Turner, would tan his hide if he lost another animal. The farm had already suffered a hard spring with floods washing out their best corn, and every head of cattle mattered. Grabbing a length of rope and slinging it over his shoulder, Caleb vaulted the fence and sprinted after the calf. The animal's cries grew faint as it pushed deeper into the thicket. The woods were a strange place, land that even the oldest settlers in town said carried a hush about it. Folks in the nearby settlement of Dawson's Crossing spoke of the trees like they were older than memory, a tangle of oaks and cottonwoods that seemed to watch a man when he passed beneath their canopy. Caleb never paid much mind to superstitions. He was a farm boy, not a fool. But as he followed the calf's trail into the shadows, a prickling unease crawled up the back of his neck. The woods swallowed the last rays of daylight, and the air grew damp and heavy. Branches cracked under Caleb's boots, and mosquitoes buzzed at his ears. He whistled low, the way he always called the herd, hoping the familiar sound might draw the calf back. Instead, silence pressed closer, broken only by the faint rustle of movement ahead. He quickened his pace, pushing past low branches until he broke into a small clearing where moonlight spilled silver across the ground. That's when he saw it. The calf stood frozen at the edge of the clearing, trembling, its wide eyes fixed not on Caleb, but on something across the glade. Caleb followed its gaze and felt his stomach twist. There, half hidden in the shadows, was something that should not exist. That seemed to watch a man when he passed beneath their canopy. Caleb never paid much mind to superstitions. He was a farm boy, not a fool. But as he followed the calf's trail into the shadows, a prickling unease crawled up the back of his neck. He slowed his pace, breathing harder now, the rope swaying against his shoulder as he moved through the thickening brush. The air here felt different, cooler, damp, with the scent of moss and earth, as though the woods were holding its breath. The calf's bleats came again, sharp and frightened, somewhere ahead. Caleb pushed through a wall of brambles and stumbled into a clearing he had never seen before. The moon hung high, silvering the grass and broken stones scattered across the ground. The calf stood near the center, trembling, its eyes wide and white with terror. Caleb followed the line of its gaze, and that's when he froze. At the far side of the clearing loomed a shape that made no sense. It wasn't a tree. though at first glance it might have been mistaken for one. It stood taller than a man, its frame twisting and jagged with bark-like ridges running along its surface. But where branches should have sprouted, there were arms, long crooked limbs ending in claw-like fingers that twitched as though tasting the air. Its head was a hollowed shape, and inside burned two faintly glowing embers set deep where eyes should have been. The thing swayed slowly, like a tree caught in a wind Caleb couldn't feel. For a long moment, neither moved. The calf whimpered, and the sound seemed to stir the creature. Its ember eyes flared, and with a groan that rumbled through the clearing, it turned toward Caleb. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but his legs locked beneath him. He'd heard tales around Dawson's Crossing, old Indian warnings, whispers of watchers in the woods who punished men for taking more than the land gave. His father dismissed them as ghost stories. But here in the heavy silence, Caleb knew he was staring at something no preacher or schoolteacher could explain away. The creature took a step forward, its limbs creaking, and the earth seemed to shudder under its weight. The calf bolted, crashing into the brush behind Caleb and vanishing into the dark. Caleb remained rooted, his breath ragged, unable to look away as the thing loomed closer. "Back," he whispered hoarsely, his hand fumbling for the rope slung over his shoulder as if it could somehow defend him. The creature stopped. Its ember eyes dimmed to a faint glow, and for a moment Caleb thought it might retreat. But then its head tilted, slow and deliberate, studying him the way a man might study a caged animal, and then, impossibly, it spoke. The sound was not words as men spoke them, but a grinding voice that rose like stones dragged over steel. Caleb could not understand the language, yet some part of him, something buried deep in his bones, recognized its meaning. "You are not meant to be here." Caleb's blood ran cold. His chest tightened, the rope slipping from his fingers, as if his hands had forgotten what they were for. He could hear his heart drumming in his ears, a loud, insistent beat that made the world contract until there was nothing left but the thing in front of him and the sound of his own breathing. The ember eyes watched him, not hateful exactly, but old, older than the town, older than the trail ruts that scarred the prairie, older than the stories the settlers tossed around campfires when the whiskey ran low and the dark crept close. I'm just here for the calf," Caleb managed, voice little more than a rasp. "Didn't mean to trespass none." The creature's head tilted again, the ember glow dimming, then flaring as if the words were a wind stoking a coal bed. When it spoke a second time, the meaning reached him the way warmth reaches a chilled hand. Slowly, then all at once. "Leave what is lost," came the grinding rumble, "and return to the open ground. There is debt in these shadows. Men have forgotten it. The earth has not." Caleb swallowed hard. He wanted to turn and run, to put a mile of prairie between himself and that voice. But a stubborn streak, the same one that kept him mending fences in a storm because a gate off its hinge was a dare to coyotes, held him there. The calf was his responsibility. He took a half step to the side, eyes flicking toward the brush where the animal had vanished. The creature's limbs creaked. "Not that way." "Look," Caleb said, forcing his mouth to work around the dryness, "my P8 needs every head. If I go home empty—" A wind that wasn't a wind brushed his face, smelling of damp loam and lightning-struck wood. The ember eyes brightened, and the creature's hands, if hands they were, opened, long fingers splaying like antlers against the dark. "You were warned," the voice grated, "years ago, before your lines were dug and your posts driven and your beasts drank where they should not. The stones were stacked, the signs were set, men took them down." Caleb thought of the ring of odd rocks he'd turned up with the plow last spring, their faces carved with small cuts and looping marks he'd taken for idle scratches. He'd used them to line the herb garden his ma kept by the kitchen window. He felt sick. "I didn't know," he whispered. The thing's head bent lower, so close Caleb could see tiny luminous motes shifting within the hollows of its eyes, slow as fireflies in winter. Knowing is not always the same as listening. Behind him Branches snapped. Caleb whirled. The calf stood just beyond the edge of the clearing, legs braced and shaking, its sides heaving. A soft, nearly human sound leaked from its throat. The creature made a motion, like a tree sighing. "Go," it said, not to the calf, but to Caleb. "Take the small one and leave. Do not come again." Caleb gathered himself. He didn't speak, didn't bow, didn't do much of anything except move slowly toward the calf with empty hands, making the soft clicks he used around the herd. The calf flinched at first, but as though some current in the air had shifted, it let him close enough to loop the rope around its neck. He backed away, step by step, not daring to turn his back on the creature until the brush reached his shoulders. Only then did he glance once more at the ember eyes. They were dimmer now, but not gone, watching. He didn't run so much as he let his legs move at the speed his fear demanded, stumbling over roots and slick rocks as the calf tugged and skittered through the trees. When they burst into the open pasture, the last wash of moonlight felt like a hand on his shoulder. The calf, frantic and obedient at once, followed him all the way to the fence and through the gap, where it promptly bolted back to the herd with an indignant bawl that made the other cattle lift their heads. Caleb patched the gap with a board and a length of twisted wire, his hands shaking so badly he pricked his fingers twice before he finished. He stood there long after the last nail was struck, eyes on the dark seam where the prairie gave way to trees. The night seemed normal again, the chirr of crickets, the far yip of a coyote, the soft wind-ruffled hush of grass. But there was a new edge to it, a razor-thin awareness that the world he knew had a place where it opened like a split lip, and something on the other side had teeth. He told himself he wouldn't say a word to his PA. Samuel Turner believed in two things, the Lord and labor, and men should be quiet with both. He'd have no patience for talk about ember-eyed shapes in the woods. The farm needed hands, not visions, and yet as Caleb put away his hammer and slunk toward the small house with its lantern in the window, he felt the story pressing against his ribs. It wanted out like a bird trapped behind a pane of glass. He slept badly and woke before dawn to the smell of coffee and his mother's skillet. Ruth Turner had a way of waking a house with quiet clatter, the practical musicality of spoons and plates, and a soft humming under her breath. Caleb sat at the rough pine table, mouth dry and hands wrapped around a chipped cup. "Fence?" Samuel asked, lowering himself onto the bench opposite, his face a map of sun and work and weather. "Patched," Caleb said. His voice sounded normal, which surprised him. "Calf's back." "Calf never should have been gone," Samuel replied, not unkindly, and tore a piece of biscuit in half. "Mind the southeast corner today. Coyotes got bold last night. Heard them close." Caleb nodded and said nothing about embers or warnings or stones stacked in circles. He kept it to himself through chores, through the heat that rose like steam off the fields, through the hammering and the hauling and the quick lunch his ma sent him out with, through the dusty walk into Dawson's Crossing in the afternoon to pick up mail and salt, through the sound of the blacksmith's anvil ringing like a bell and the gossip of women on the mercantile porch. He broke his silence in the most unexpected place, the telegraph office. Eliza Mayfield ran the machine with a speed and economy that made Caleb think of the way swallows cut the air. She was exactly his age, which meant he'd spent the last 4 years pretending not to look at her in church while looking at her constantly. She had clever hands and dark hair she pinned in a way that kept it off her face without flattening the curl, and she had opinions that made the men on the porch shift their feet because they were used to women softening their thoughts with sugar. "Pick up for Turner," she said, glancing up as he stepped inside, the steady tap-tap of the key continuing even as she reached for the mail on the shelf. "Here," Caleb said, and then the words tumbled out before he could stop them. "I saw something last night." "Dramatic," Eliza said, raising one eyebrow. "A coyote? A milk snake?" Mrs. Higgins says she saw the devil in the northern sky after supper, but it was just the new locomotive's smoke. "I was chasing a calf," he said, feeling the heat creep up his neck. "Into the woods." Her fingers stilled on the key. "Go on," she said, voice softened, and he told her, more than he meant to, less than he wanted to, about the clearing and the creature and the voice like driven stones. He didn't mention the words it had spoken. Somehow saying them out loud felt like striking a match in a barn full of dry hay. Eliza listened without interruption. When he finished, she rose from the desk and pulled the door shut with its squeak of hinges, so the porch talk wouldn't drift inside. "My ma would call that a warden," she said finally. "A what?" "A warden, a keeper. My granddad used to tell us stories before the railroad men made him mean. He said there were guardians in places the land didn't want us. Not demons, not angels, just old. He said you could pass through their woods if you came with your hat in your hands and your pockets empty. He said if you came with greed, you never came out." Caleb swallowed. "I didn't have greed." "No," Eliza said with a small smile. "You had a calf." He leaned against the counter, grateful for the solid wood against his back. "It told me not to come again." "Then don't," Eliza said simply. "You Turners are known for stubbornness, but this seems like the sort of warning you hang on your wall in big stitched letters." He huffed. "My PA won't like leaving fence broken near the tree line." "Your PA won't like dying of something a doctor can't name," Eliza said, and the wryness in her voice didn't hide the seriousness in her eyes. "Men who don't believe in monsters usually haven't met one that believed in them." A bell clanged up the street, harsh and insistent. Both of them flinched. Caleb moved to the window. The men on the porch were already straightening, turning toward the sound. The church bell only rang like that for fire or death. It was fire. By the time Caleb and Eliza reached the edge of town, smoke was shouldering into the sky from the direction of the Turner place, thick and dark and angry. Caleb ran until his chest felt like it would split. Eliza kept pace as long as she could, then veered toward the livery to fetch a horse. He didn't wait. The farm came into view like a bad dream. The old hay barn, the one Samuel swore every spring there wasn't money to replace, was a tower of flame. The heat slapped Caleb's face. Sparks leapt to the sloped roofs of the cattle sheds where wet feed and damp wood held the fire at bay, barely. "Ma!" he shouted, voice cracking. "Pa!" Ruth Turner staggered out of the house with a bucket in each hand, her apron of flour and ash. Samuel and the hired hand, a quiet man named Abel who sang to the cows when he thought no one could hear, were throwing water at the barn door in useless arcs. The fire had already eaten the rafters. They groaned like a ship's hull in a storm. "Back!" Caleb yelled as he ran to Samuel. "It'll fall!" "Livestock," Samuel panted, pointing. "Get them clear." Caleb tore toward the corral and started shoving the cattle toward the back pasture, slapping flanks, whistling, cursing when one stubborn cow tried to turn back. Eliza came thundering through the gate on a blown livery mare, slid off, handed the reins to Ruth, and jumped the fence to help Caleb with her skirts tucked up like a boy's. Between shouts and smoke and raw fear, the world narrowed to movement, to the simple grim math of what could be saved with 2 buckets and 4 hands and the knowledge of how wind shifts. The barn collapsed in a gout of sparks. Everyone flinched, ducking as a sheet of heat rolled over them. Ruth's hair singed at the ends. Samuel pressed his forearm over his mouth and coughed until he bent over his knees. When he straightened, char and sweat streaked his cheeks like war paint. He looked old and new at once. "We needed that barn," he said, voice flat, a fact delivered into air that would not take it. "We need you more," Ruth said, and touched his face. They stood like that for one breath, then another, the way people do in the middle of something when their bodies insist on a small mercy. It was Eliza who saw the tracks first, faint gouges in the dirt at the barn's rear, where the ground was still damp from last night's storm. She crouched, squinting through the smoke. "Caleb," she called, "here." The marks were odd, not hoof prints, not wagon wheels, 2 parallel gashes as if something heavy had been dragged from the woods to the barn and then away again. The trail led back toward the tree line, as straight as a plumb line, as if a compass needle had dragged iron through clay. Samuel looked, and his mouth thinned. "Boys," he said, and even though only Caleb and Abel were there, the word carried like a whip crack across years. "Axes! Rifles! We'll find who did this." "Pa," Caleb said, feeling the creature's voice like a reed in his ear, bending low against the wind. "What if it wasn't who?" Samuel's eyes flicked to his son's face. He had the kind of gaze that made men move, because it held the weight of work and the memory of winters that had almost taken things no man should have to give. "What did you see last night?" he asked, too quickly, as if he had already decided he wouldn't believe it. "Speak plain." And for the first time, Caleb tried. He told him about the clearing and the ember eyes and the warning. He left out Eliza's word, warden, and kept his voice steady the way a boy does when he needs to be a man in the eyes of the man he wants to be like. Samuel listened without folding his arms or looking away or snorting, which was something. When Caleb finished, Samuel's jaw worked. "Superstition," he said finally, but the word sounded like a fence post driven into rocky ground. This was done by men, and men can be answered. "Answered," Ruth repeated, and there was a tiredness in the syllables that made Samuel's shoulders hitch. "Sam, the boy's not lying. We've all felt something in those trees since the flood. Leave it be." "Leave it be," Samuel said, and looked at the smoking ruin of his barn. "On whose coin? Should I tell the winter not to come too?" Eliza, who had no business in family quarrels, and less interest in staying out of them than she should, said quietly, "The tracks run to the woods. Whoever or whatever carried tinder that way would know the clearing. Going after it would do nothing but bring you where you were told not to be." Samuel turned a gaze on her that made most folk shift their weight. She did not. He sighed, a sound like the scrape of a boot heel. "We'll rebuild," he said at last, and the set of his mouth told Caleb he hadn't abandoned the idea of an answer. He had only stored it in the place he kept his grudges until they ripened. The town rallied the way towns do when fire puts a mark on the horizon. Men arrived with buckets and boards, women with bread and scolding tongues, children with eyes like saucers, and a barely leashed delight at being useful. By dusk, the worst of the blaze was a bed of sullen coals, and a rough plan lay where the barn had stood, a smaller structure first to carry them through harvest, then a new main barn before the first hard freeze, when the last wagon rattled down the track and the cattle settled, lowing softly as the night cooled. Caleb walked alone to the fence line where pasture became shadow. He did not step through. He stood with his hands hooked in the wire and his hat low, and whispered toward the trees, not a prayer exactly, and not a question, but something with the shape of both. No answer came. Only the night's ordinary music, the rustle of leaves, the distant splash of the creek, and the slow knowledge working into him like the ache after a day of haying. The woods had a debt ledger, and someone had written the Turner name there. In the morning, Dawson's Crossing woke to a rumor that took legs before breakfast. Ezra Pike was coming. Pike had not earned his money with a plow or a hammer. He was one of those men who smelled money the way a bloodhound smells blood. He had a hand in the railroad, a finger in the mines, and a whole arm up to the elbow in land speculation. He wore city clothes that made the prairie look like a dare, and carried a gold-tipped cane he didn't need, just so you'd remember he had it. He had been to Dawson's Crossing once 2 years back, with papers in a leather folio and a Pinkerton on each shoulder. The town had not enjoyed it. By noon his carriage rolled in a cloud of dust, its dark lacquer catching sunlight in hard flashes. He stepped out onto the street like a man greeting old friends he had never bothered to learn the names of, swept his hat, and smiled in a way that showed teeth without warmth. "Gentlemen," he said, as if addressing the whole of Dawson's Crossing at once, and made for the hotel porch like it owed him rent. Caleb stood by the water trough, hand on the halter of a skittish colt, and watched from under the brim of his hat. He didn't know why his stomach went tight at the sight of the man. Perhaps it was the timing. Perhaps it was the way rumor and fire had braided themselves in his mind so tightly that anything new felt like the same rope just pulled from a different coil. Sheriff Hal Briggs met Pike at the foot of the porch. Briggs was slow in a solid way, the way a man is when he has decided no one's sense of urgency is going to push his. "Mr. Pike," he said mildly, "what calls you out our way?" "The same thing that calls any man with an eye for opportunity," Pike replied, as if the sheriff had made a joke, which he had not. "I'm headed through to the junction north of here. Thought I'd stop by. There's talk along the line about this town." "Is there?" Briggs said. "Strange doings," Pike said. "Cattle skittish, barns burning, miners to the east complaining of lost tools and tunnels collapsing where there were no tunnels to begin with. Old wives' tales are bad for investors' nerves. I aim to replace them with facts." Eliza passed with a stack of telegraph blanks in her arms. Pike's eyes slid over her, then flicked away in that particular way of a man who has decided a woman exists only insofar as she can carry something for him. Eliza did not slow. She did not look at him. If her shoulders squared by a whisper, it was only to keep the papers from slipping. By supper, Pike had installed himself in 2 rooms and made an invitation sound like an order delivered to half the men in town. Meet him in the hotel dining room at 8 for a discussion of Dawson's future. Samuel Turner went. So did the mayor, the blacksmith, the preacher, the owners of the mercantile and the livery, and a handful of ranchers who thought their names should be carved in the wood of any table where decisions were made. Caleb did not go. He stood outside with Abel and 2 other hired hands from neighboring farms, trading guesses like boys trade marbles. "Railspur," Abel said. "He'll want right-of-way through Turner Fields and McCabe pasture." "Or the timber rights east of the creek," said a man named Harlan, who smelled perpetually of horse. "Sawmill's hungry." "Or he's here about the mine accident," offered the third, a round-shouldered fellow who had no luck with hats. "My cousin says the earth slid out from under their shoring like somebody pulled it, like something pulled it." At 9 the dining-room doors opened, and men filtered out in 2s and 3s with that look of people who have been promised something in a box they are not allowed to open yet. Samuel came last, his face set and unreadable. "Well?" Caleb asked. Samuel tightened the cords on his coat. "Pike says the railroad will extend a spur south. Says it'll bring wages and buyers and another church if the preacher wants one." "And what does he want?" Caleb said, knowing the answer but needing to hear it. "Wood," Samuel said. "He wants wood and stone and a way through the north woods to save him 6 months and a bend of track." Caleb felt the words like a cold hand on his wrist. "The north woods," he repeated. "Don't start," Samuel said, not looking at him. "Men have been cutting timber since men learned axes. You want to tell me we can't cut ours because you spooked yourself chasing a calf?" "It wasn't—" "Enough," Samuel snapped, and the word was iron. Caleb shut his mouth because there are times a boy's sense of the world will keep, and his place with his father will not. But as they walked home, the road dim and the stars like cut tin in the sky, he felt something like a taut line in him, a fish pulling at the end of it, deeper and stronger than the hand holding the pole. The next day, axes rang in the north woods in a new way. Not the careful bite of a farmer taking what he needs, not the respectful 3-tree harvest of men who plan to pass their land to sons, but the greedy, unpausing rhythm of hired work that has been paid to forget anything that can't be put in a ledger. The sound carried over the fields, and the cows lifted their heads uneasily, and the air took on the scent of resin and disruption. Caleb lasted until noon. He had promised his ma he wouldn't go, and the promise lived in his chest like a pebble in a shoe. He broke it anyway. He told himself he'd only go to the edge. He told himself he'd only look. His feet told him he was a liar, and took him along the path he knew with his eyes closed. He found the cutting party in the second clearing, the one closer to the creek. 6 men with broad shoulders and narrow scruples, paid by Pike, and led by a foreman whose voice had a whip's crack. They had felled 4 trees and were notching a 5th when the ground shivered under Caleb's boots. "Hold!" the foreman barked. because he was a man who believed in obedience and did not like being contradicted by the earth. The shiver became a long, low groan that rose from the soil itself, a protest that vibrated in Caleb's teeth. The men shifted uneasy, and then the tree they were notching split with a sound like a cry. Sap bled across the cut in a sticky sheet. The men stepped back in a ragged line. One of them crossed himself. Another spat and said a word his mother would have slapped him for. The foreman cursed them all and reached for his axe. "Don't," Caleb said, surprising himself. The foreman turned, saw a farm boy with hat in hand and a rope at his belt, and did not alter the expression his face was wearing. "Get," he said, "this is company work." "You need to stop," Caleb said, because he had no plan, only the surety that if he didn't say it, something inside him would break in a new and permanent way. "This land, it's not ours to take like this." The foreman stared at him with the particular contempt of a man who has been told no by someone he doesn't think has the right to say it. "You Ezra Pike's boy?" he asked. "No? Then you aren't anyone who gets to tell me how to swing an axe." He swung. The blade bit cruelly. Sap spattered his boots. The ground shuddered again, harder. This time the men felt it. "Thunder," one said. There was no thunder. They learned all at once where thunder could come from. It unfolded from the line of oaks like a shadow tearing itself loose. Ember eyes flared in the deep. The creature stepped into the clearing, and the taste of iron rose in Caleb's mouth. The men dropped their axes in a clatter of fear dressed as clumsiness. The foreman swore in a voice an octave higher than the last one he used. "Jesus, Mary," one of the cutters said, and the name broke off because the thing was not a devil you could scare with a church word. It was something else. "Leave," the voice said, the old grinding of rock against rock turning the air thick. "Debt paid by fire did not teach you. Shall I teach you with blood?" "We don't want trouble," the foreman said, which was technically true in the way a man who has already caused trouble can claim he did not want it when it arrives. He grabbed his axe with both hands again, because men feel safer with steel, even when steel is a language the thing in front of them does not speak. Caleb stepped between the foreman and the creature before he had time to think about dying. "Stop," he said, his voice turning the single syllable into an object he held up like a shield. "Please." The ember eyes shifted to him. For a heartbeat the clearing held its breath. "Boy," the creature said, except it did not say boy, not exactly. It said the thing Caleb had been in his father's eyes since he could first walk to the barn without falling, the thing he had been in his mother's hands, the thing he was standing here with his hat forgotten at his side and his breath making the air shake. "You came back." "I told them not to cut," Caleb said, and there was no point in pretending he had done any such thing before this minute. "I'm asking now, if it's a debt, who owes it?" "Those who unstacked the stones," the creature said. "Those who drank the creek when it was low, those who cut without asking and take without leaving, those who bring the iron road through the bones of the hills and wake the sleeping places with sparks." "Pike," Caleb whispered. The foreman heard it and bristled like a dog. "Mr. Pike is a businessman," the foreman snapped. "Whatever you are, you ain't a man that's going to cost him money." "Then he costs himself," Caleb said, and he did not recognize his own voice so much as he recognized the place it came from, a deep artesian well of anger and fear and love for the land that had raised him, and the knowledge that everything had limits and men had a talent for not seeing them until they walked off the edge. Behind him, branches crashed. Sheriff Briggs stepped into the clearing with 3 men and a revolver in his hand that he did not lift. Briggs took off his hat. He looked at the creature, and he looked at the boy, and then at the foreman and back again, and the calculus in his eyes would have impressed a banker. "Foreman," he said slowly, "you'll pull your men out." "On whose authority?" the foreman demanded, but his voice lacked marrow now, and a thread of fear was woven through it. "On mine," Briggs said, "and on the earth's, which seems to be speaking louder than I am." The foreman darted a glance to the creature and then to the sheriff and then, finally, to the path that would take him away. He did not nod. He simply hollered, "Tools!" and the men scrambled to gather what hadn't been dropped beyond finding, and they went, not quite running, because pride can limp faster than fear can. When they were gone and the sound of their going was swallowed by leaves, the creature's head lowered until it was almost even with Caleb's. "You carry the shape of those who listened long ago," it said. "There were fewer then. They did not stay. The ones who stayed forgot. Remembering is a kind of staying." "I will," Caleb said. His legs shook with the force of his not falling over. "But Pike—" "Men with canes think they are taller than trees," the voice said, which would have been funny if the world were not the way it was. "They find out different. Tell the one with the iron star," the ember eyes flicked to Briggs, "that his boundary line lies 8 steps inside the place where the moss grows longest on the north side of the stones. He will know it when he sees it. He will know it in his bones." Briggs's mouth tightened around something like agreement. "I'll mark it," he said. "If they tear it up, they'll answer to me before they answer to you. Might be kinder that way." "Kinder," the creature said, and there was a shape of humor in it, thin as a twig. "Perhaps." It drew back into the trees, and the clearing's other sounds returned in a rush, like a held breath let go. Caleb found he had his hat in his hand after all. He put it on and stared at Briggs, who stared back like a man who had just sat down next to the part of the river that takes men and returns their boots. "You going to tell Pike?" the sheriff asked. "He'll know," Caleb said. "Men like that always know what they shouldn't." "Then we'll make sure he knows this," Briggs said, and clapped Caleb once on the shoulder, and for a moment the weight of a badge and the weight of a boy's fear were equal. And then they weren't, and the boy stood a little straighter because the man had kept his hand there a heartbeat longer than he had to. The standoff did not end the matter. Men like Ezra Pike were not used to being moved off their marks by boys, sheriffs, or the earth itself. The next morning he came with papers and words like injunction and easement and public good. He did not bring the foreman. He brought 2 Pinkertons. He stood in the street as if it were a courtroom and recited his rights. "I have purchased timber rights from the McCabe parcel through the ridge and down to the creek," he said. "I have purchased a right-of-way through the Carter half-section and the hollow behind the Turner's east pasture. I have here," he lifted the folio, "signatures, seals, and the governor's stamp. If you people would like to barter stories with elements, feel free. I will trade you rails and coin for wood and stone. I do not have time for trees that talk." "Then stop talking to them," Eliza said from the telegraph office doorway. Pike ignored her. He looked at Samuel Turner, then at the sheriff, then at the cluster of men who had gathered with arms crossed and expressions that meant their wives were watching them from behind curtains and would ask questions over supper. "I start cutting again in 2 days," he said. "If you try to stop my men, you will regret it in ways that extend well beyond this town." "Mr. Pike," Briggs said, "you're a free man to take your regrettables and your regrets and put them on the road. But if your men step 8 paces inside a line I've marked, I'll put them in a cell and you in a conversation with a judge who will not find your cane charming." Pike's smile slipped. "I'm not accustomed to backwater sheriffs drawing circles I'm not allowed to step in." "Then get accustomed," Briggs said, and the way he said it made men grin into their mustaches and women breathe a little easier because somebody was saying no to a thing that wanted to be said yes to by everyone, forever. Pike left in a hinge of anger he hid well enough to make the hotelier bow. 2 days later, under dawn that came up white and hot, his men went into the woods anyway. They did not get to 8 paces. Caleb was not there when the first scream tore across the timber. He was in the Turner yard, stacking the last of the lumber townsfolk had helped them cut for the temporary barn, when a boy on a dun pony galloped past with his mouth open and no voice, pointing toward the ridge. Caleb ran. He ran because he had to, because the earth had become a thing with moving parts, and he had named one of them, and it had looked at him, and he had said he would remember. The clearing was a massacre of causes, not bodies, Axes lay in the grass like dropped thoughts. The ridgeline looked different, no, not different, revealed, as if a skin had been pulled off the hills and you could see the bones beneath. The creature loomed over the center of the clearing. The men were huddled at the edge, pressed against each other like sheep who have realized they are not the bravest animals God invented. "What happened?" Caleb asked the air, and a lumberman with a beard that didn't know what shape to be said. "The ground, it opened, it just opened. The tree, it swallowed the axe, like the roots moved." Pike was there, too, because men like him do not trust anything they haven't watched fail themselves. He was red to the ears and breathing through a tight smile. "Sheriff," he said, "you cannot tell me this is law." "I can tell you that if your men take another step, I'll put you in manacles and they in town shirts," Briggs replied. "The rest," he gestured at the creature, "isn't mine to tell." Pike stepped forward, cane planted like a flag. "I will step where I—" The cane sunk, not far, half an inch, maybe, just enough that the wood did not feel like wood anymore. Pike went still, slowly, slowly, so no one would say fear had quick fingers on his throat. He pulled the cane up. Its gold tip was not gold now. It was rust. When the air hit it, flakes came off and drifted down like a strange, slow snow. Pike looked at the creature for the first time, like it was a thing that could reorder his day. "This is," he swallowed, "unacceptable." Caleb almost laughed, because there are times when words are so poor a fit for the world that they become funny in a way that gives you back a sliver of courage. He did not laugh, because that sliver was needed elsewhere. "What do you want?" he asked the creature, and it looked at him again with that steady, infernal ember gaze. "Balance," it said, "not the silence of all things, not the hunger of one. Balance. Men may cut and burn and build, they may bury their iron, they may drink. But first they will put back the stones they took and unbury the bones they uncovered and feed the creek with what they promised and did not give." "Feed the creek," Pike said faintly, like a man speaking a language he learned yesterday and forgot overnight. "Water," Briggs translated dryly. "Let it run where they blocked it. Put back what they damned." Eliza spoke, voice even. "The McCabe boys piled rocks across the bend last winter to make a skating pool come freeze. Flood took it down and carried it to the Turner's fields. That's your debt." "Part," the creature said. "And the stones?" It turned its ember gaze on her, and she felt it like a physical hush. Old markers, she guessed. Circles, boundaries. "The first bargain," the thing said, and in that moment Caleb glimpsed it. Men with hair long as the prairie wind, women with marks on their hands, children sitting quiet on logs while elders stacked stones and spoke to the air like it was a relative you could invite to supper without worrying if you had enough chairs. The picture was so clear it hurt. "Balance," Caleb repeated and looked at Pike, who stared back with something like calculation reassembling itself on his face. "You want your spur," Caleb said to him. "We want our fields. The woods want their bargain. Do the right things in the right order, and maybe the world doesn't buck when you sit it." Pike stared at him as if the boy had turned into a ledger he had not noticed on his desk. Slowly, with a reluctance that needed witnesses, he nodded once. "The creek," he said. "We'll break the McCabe bend. The stones, if we can find them." "You can," Eliza said. "You will," Briggs added. Pike lifted his chin. "And after?" "After," the creature said, "you will build your iron road around the place where the moss grows long and the stones are stacked. The path is 8 steps inside the old line. You will not take 1 step more." "8 steps," Pike murmured, as if already calculating freight and timber and the extra days a curve would cost. He nodded again, less like a man conceding, more like a man deciding to call a thing his idea. "Fine." The thing inclined its head. The ember eyes dimmed. The roots that had wound around the axes loosened and slid back into the soil like snakes remembering their holes. The men did not cheer. They did not move. They just breathed, as if they had been forgetting to. Work, when it is the right kind, has a way of knitting people together. For the next week, Dawson's Crossing hauled rocks like contrition. Children formed chains and handed stones from the Turner garden back to the woods, placing them in a ring that felt like a promise even to those who did not believe in promises you made with your hands. The McCabe boys waded into the creek with their pants rolled and their eyes down and tore apart the dam they had built in a winter that had felt like fun, until it didn't. Men with shovels and muckrakes cleared the old stream bed until the water found its course and ran with a music that made the hair on Caleb's arms stand up. Pike's men hammered stakes at the edge of the moss line and adjusted the rail plan with blue chalk on maps that crinkled like leaves. Through it all, the creature did not appear, but people felt it like a weight lifted by degrees. The woods seemed to breathe differently. The calves stopped skittering at shadows. The mine to the east reported no new collapses, men slept better, and did not say why they did. On the day the first section of the temporary Turner barn stood, its rafters trussed and its shape clean against the sky, Samuel Turner put a hand on his son's shoulder and squeezed it once in a way that meant something not entirely about wood. Ruth Turner brought out a pie that tasted like mercy. Abel sang to the cows on purpose and did not stop when he noticed anyone listening. The town did what towns do when the worst has passed. It ate and told stories and let the talk drift around the thing everyone knew without jabbing it with a finger. Eliza found Caleb leaning against a post with a mug of coffee going cold in his hands. "You did it," she said. "We did it," he corrected. "You spoke to it," she said, and there was pride in her voice that made him want to tip his hat, even though it was already tipped. "You listened. That matters." He looked at the woods and let the quiet sit between them the way it can when you're standing next to someone who knows the shape of your day without you having to draw it. "I don't know what I am to it," he said finally. "It called me what I was. Not a man, not a boy, something else." He smiled, a little helpless. "Just a Turner with his hat in his hands, I guess." "Maybe that's all any of us are," Eliza said. "People with hats, trying to learn when to take them off." He looked at her, and for a moment the world was small and precise, and held exactly two people, which was a relief after days when it had held too many. "You'll have stories to send down the line," he said. "I will send what matters," she replied, "not what sells." She hesitated and added softer, "Sometimes those are the same, sometimes they are not." The rail spur was laid slow and careful. It curved around the moss line like a man walking wide of a fresh grave. Ezra Pike came to watch the first engine roll through the prairie wheat, its whistle a serrated sound that made the town cheer and the cattle lift their heads before lowering them again to the business of eating. Pike shook hands. He did not look at the woods. He left as he had arrived, with dust and timing and a smile that promised a new kind of trouble somewhere else. Autumn slid onto the prairie in a long slant of gold. The temporary barn was tighter than the old one had been, because when you rebuild, you use everything you've learned about where wind sneaks and damp settles. The cows came in heavy with milk. The corn bowed under its own weight. Caleb grew taller in a way that was less about inches and more about where he put his feet. Samuel watched him sometimes and did not say anything, and then, when they were stringing wire one evening, said, "You did good." And that was like two sentences and a future and a father's hand on a boy's shoulder all at once. It would be a mistake to say the woods went quiet forever. They did not. They had not been waiting to be appeased so they could turn into a stand of simple trees. Sometimes at night, when the wind was in the southeast and the damp rose, Caleb would step onto the porch and hear a low sound from the hills that was not the whistle of a train and not the cry of a coyote. It was a sound that meant the world was wider than he could walk, and he would feel afraid, but not the hopeless kind, more like the sort that makes a person keep his eyes open and his hat in his hands. He went back to the clearing exactly once, in late fall, when the light on the grass went blue by mid-afternoon, and the first hard frost laid a film of sugar on the fence rails. He went because a part of him had the manners to say, "Thank you," where thank you was due. He stood at the edge of the stones people had returned and did not step inside them. He said, "We've kept our end." And the leaves rustled in a way that might have been wind and might have been an answer. A single ember spark drifted in the shade and went out before it touched the ground. He did not tell anyone about that part. It was not a secret. It was just something that lived best in the place where you keep the things that steady you when you are mending fence in a sleet squall and your hands don't want to be hands anymore. Winter came the way it always does, and in the nights when the stars were so sharp they could cut you and the snow creaked under boots like old boards, Caleb would sit by the stove and carve a small thing with his pocket knife, not knowing what it was until the wood told him. He carved a circle of stones, and a tiny sapling he set in the middle of it, and he set them on the mantel. Ruth dusted around them without comment. Samuel looked once, nodded, and didn't move them when he set the rifle above the hearth for cleaning. In spring the creek ran clean. Wildflowers spilled in the places the feeder streams rejoined the main course, as if color had to go somewhere when men stacked it up and it could finally flow again. Children made boats of bark and raced them, and the boats didn't snag on old dams and sink the way they used to. The rail spur carried wheat and timber, and a preacher who could sing, and a bookbinder who stayed, and on Sundays the church was fuller than it had been, and less sure of itself in the good way, the way that means people have seen something that made them realize they don't know what they thought they did. Eliza sent telegraphs that said simply, "Harvest good," and "Rail on time," and "Turner barn standing," and the operators down the line sent back "praise" and "envied" and "how," and she did not answer the last except to say, "Balance." Her mother shook her head and smiled, and said the girl had always been inclined to put big words in small envelopes. There were other fires because the world is not the kind of place where lessons hold everything still. There were dry summers and 2 wet springs and illnesses men could name and men could not. There were new men with new canes and new papers and new smiles that did not include the eyes. There were nights when the woods sang and men stood at their doors and did not pretend the wind was the only thing that knows songs. Through it all, there were fences to mend and calves to pull and pies to bring when someone's house was marked by smoke. There was the knowledge that sometimes the thing that shouldn't exist is the thing you most need to see to understand where you stand. On a late summer evening, 2 years after the barn burned, Caleb and Eliza stood at the fence line, their shoulders almost touching. They had said most of the words people say when they are trying to say the few that matter, and they had decided to say those in front of the pastor and behind a cake. The sun was half lost behind the hills. The grass made a soft hush. The woods were ordinary, and not, as always. "Do you think it knew you would come that first night?" Eliza asked. "I think it knew a boy would," Caleb said. "Maybe not which one." "You went back," she said, not a question. "Once," he said, "to say thank you." Eliza smiled. "Then do it again." He looked at her, not at the trees, and said, "Thank you." "For what?" she teased. "For staying," he said, and that was the right answer. She took his hand without a fuss. The sky darkened. A single ember spark drifted in the shadow of the wood and went out before it touched the ground. Caleb saw it and did not move, and when Eliza asked what he was looking at, he said, "Balance," and she squeezed his hand once in a way that meant more than words. That night, when the wind shifted and brought the smell of the creek and the faintest, oldest music from the hills, the farm boy who had chased a calf into the woods lay awake in a house that felt warm in a way wood alone cannot accomplish. He thought of stones and circles, of water running where it is meant to run, of tracks curved around what should be curved around and not run through it, because it is there and can be run through. He thought of men with canes who learn how to walk. He thought of a voice like grinding rock saying, "You carry the shape of those who listened." He slept finally, and dreamed of an open field that wasn't quite the prairie, and a forest that wasn't quite the Turner woods, and a sense that if he walked both with his hat in his hands, he could cross from one to the other without losing anything he wanted to keep. In the morning the fences needed mending again, the cows needed milking, the train was late by 10 minutes, and the day broke over Dawson's Crossing, like it always had and always would. Exactly the same, because men needed it to be, and just different enough to keep them honest. The summer sun hung low over the Kansas plains, its dying light spilling gold across the tall grass that waved like a restless sea. 17-year-old Caleb Turner leaned on his fence post, straw hat pushed back, his blue eyes scanning the herd grazing in the fading day. The rhythm of farm life was steady, unchanging, milk at dawn, plow through noon, mend by dusk. But tonight that rhythm faltered. A sharp bleat split the air. Caleb's head snapped up. His heart sank as he saw a tan-speckled calf, barely old enough to graze alone, squeeze through a gap in the fence near the tree line. The young animal darted into the woods, its cries thin and desperate. Caleb cursed under his breath. His father would tan his hide if another calf was lost. The farm had already endured a spring flood that had ruined their best corn, and every head of cattle mattered. Grabbing a length of rope, Caleb vaulted the fence and sprinted after it. The woods were a place of whispers. Folks in Dawson's Crossing said those trees were older than memory, oaks and cottonwoods that carried a hush about them, as though the land itself held breath. Old Indian warnings told of watchers there, guardians who punished men for taking too much. Caleb had always dismissed such tales. He was a farm boy, not a fool. Yet as he stepped beneath the dark canopy, the air shifted. Damp earth swallowed sound, and every step felt too loud, too heavy, as if the forest itself disapproved of his presence. The calf's bleats echoed faintly ahead. Caleb pushed through brambles until he stumbled into a small clearing bathed in silver moonlight. The calf stood trembling in the center, wide-eyed and fixed not on Caleb, but on something across the glade. Caleb followed its gaze and froze. At the far edge of the clearing loomed a shape that should not exist. It rose taller than any man, twisted and jagged like a tree, but with crooked limbs ending in clawed fingers. Its head was a hollowed mass, and inside burned 2 embers where eyes ought to be. The thing swayed, creaking like bark in a wind Caleb could not feel. For a long moment nothing moved. Then, with a groan that rumbled through the earth, the creature turned toward him. The calf bolted past, crashing into the brush, but Caleb's legs locked. The air vibrated. A grinding voice rose like stone dragged across stone, not words as men spoke them, but words his bones understood. "You are not meant to be here." Caleb's blood ran cold. He gripped the rope as though it could shield him. "I'm just here for the calf," he rasped. "Didn't mean no harm." The ember eyes flared brighter. The voice deepened. Men were warned. Stones were set. Boundaries broken. Debts remain. Caleb thought of the carved rocks he'd unearthed last spring with the plow. Odd stones he'd stacked by his mother's garden, thinking them nothing more than curiosities. His mouth went dry. "I didn't know," he whispered. "Not knowing is not listening," the thing groaned. Branches cracked behind him, the calf, waiting just beyond the brush. Caleb's heart pounded. "Go," the creature rumbled. "Take the small one. Do not return." Caleb didn't argue. He looped the rope around the calf's neck and backed away, never taking his eyes off those glowing embers. Only when the forest swallowed the figure did he turn and run, dragging the calf until pasture grass brushed his boots and the moonlight felt safe again. That night he told no one, not his father, not his mother, not even Eliza Mayfield, the sharp-eyed telegraph girl who seemed to read thoughts from a man's face. He lay awake instead, hearing the words again and again. Stones were set, boundaries broken, debts remain. But debts have a way of coming due, and by the time Ezra Pike, the railroad man with his cane and his papers, arrived in Dawson's Crossing with talk of cutting through the North Woods, Caleb would understand the warning had not been for him alone. It had been for them all. Ezra Pike came to Dawson's Crossing behind a pair of glossy blacks and a lacquered carriage that looked too clean for roads that knew rain. He stepped down with a smile he wore like a medal, palm resting on a gold-tipped cane he didn't need, and knew everyone's name without having earned the right. He shook the sheriff's hand like he owned the badge and tipped his hat to the preacher's wife as if he had personally arranged the weather. By supper time he was holding court in the hotel dining room, talking about prosperity the way a gambler talks about luck when his sleeves are thick with cards. Caleb stood on the street beneath the porch's shadow and watched men drift in through the hotel doors. Samuel Turner among them, jaw set in that way of his that meant the bills were adding up somewhere behind his eyes. Eliza Mayfield passed, hair pinned up neat, a stack of telegraph forms in her arm like a sheaf of pale leaves. "You look like you swallowed a burr," she said, pausing. "Pike's planning to cut the North Woods," Caleb answered. Eliza's gaze flicked to the line where pasture gave way to trees. "Then he's planning to bleed a vein you don't open without asking." She lowered her voice. "Did you tell your PA what you saw?" "No." The admission sat heavy. "He'd call it campfire talk." "Sometimes that's where the truth warms its hands," she said, and moved on, the bell over the telegraph door chiming once like a question. The meeting ran long. Men came out looking like they'd eaten too much and couldn't say no to dessert. Samuel emerged last, coat folded over one arm, dust on his boots, and resolve on his mouth. "Well?" Caleb asked. "Rail spur," Samuel said. "Quick money. Buyer's on our doorstep. He wants timbers from the North Ridge, stone from the creek cut. He's offering good coin." He paused. Too good. Caleb swallowed. The calf's frightened bleat still rode the back of his throat. "The Woods won't like it." Samuel looked at him then, that weighing look. Woods don't get a say, men do. The first night the saws sang, coyotes went quiet. On the second, the wind came out of the east and tasted like damp iron. On the third, fire took the Turner barn. It started with a hiss like a kettle and went to roaring as quick as a match finding spilled lamp oil. Caleb woke to heat on his face, and Ruth's voice turned to iron. He and Samuel and Abel the hand ran with buckets in a line that felt more ceremonial than useful. Flames wrote themselves up old timbers, like handwriting a man couldn't read but understood well enough to fear. Sparks whirled into the sky and fled toward the cattle sheds. The cows lowed and pressed against one another, big-eyed and confused. Eliza arrived a minute after the bell, boots thudding, hair coming loose, taking a bucket without being asked, and shoving it into Caleb's hands when his shook too hard. They saved what they could, which wasn't much. When what had been the barn fell in on itself with a sound like a giant coughing, they stood in the red wash of heat and breathed smoke until they had words again. It was Eliza who found the marks, 2 drag gouges clawed into damp earth, leading from the tree line to the black mouth of the barn door. Not wheels, not hooves, something that had weight and patience. Samuel stared at those marks a long time. "Men did this," he said finally, not much like he believed it, more like he wanted to. "Then you'll find fingerprints on ash," Eliza murmured, not quite under her breath. They buried the heat under shovels of dirt and what was left under a tarp. Ruth turned her apron to the clean side and brewed coffee for hands that couldn't stop shaking. By noon the town had brought tools and talk and the helpful lies people tell when their eyes are too wide. "We'll have you right again by harvest, Sam. Wood dries quick in this part of Kansas. The Lord owes you rain, and I bet he pays." Ezra Pike came too, standing at the fence with his cane and his clean boots, surveying the ruin like it was a ledger. "Unfortunate," he said, and the word was too small. "We can move up the spur's timeline, bring you income sooner." Samuel's mouth twitched, not quite a sneer, not quite consent. That evening, when the men went to ask the sheriff about a watch, Caleb went back to the fence where daylight ended. He did not step past it. He took off his hat and held it in both hands. "You said there were debts?" he said to the dark. "I'm listening." For a while the only answer was the creek's distant talk and the prickle of heat still coming off the ground. Then from the seam in the trees a shape unstuck itself from shadow. It did not come close. The ember eyes were banked, the way a homestead stove waits through the night. "Burn," it said, and the voice pushed the word out like a stone. "For fire that came before, for stones unstacked, for water taken." Caleb's scalp crawled. "I didn't set anything." "Not you," it said, and the dim light inside its head made the leaves behind it glow thin as paper. "Your kind." "How do we pay it?" he asked, because the question lived in him now and wouldn't be quiet. "How do we set it right?" The eyes lowered, curious. "You ask. Your father cuts, the Iron Man cuts more." "Pike," Caleb said. He felt it hear the cane in the name. "Balance," it said. "Put back what was taken. Curve where you would cut straight. Let the creek run where it remembers. 8 steps inside where the moss grows longest. No more." 8 steps. It swayed, which might have been a nod or the tree's breath. "Tell the one with the iron star," it added. And then it was only shadow in shadow again. Sheriff Hal Briggs heard Caleb out without interrupting or looking away. He was a man whose quiet made other men fill it with better words than they'd planned, and Caleb's came out cleaner than he'd rehearsed. 8 steps inside the moss, Briggs repeated, like he was measuring it with his mouth. He scratched his jaw, then took his hat down from its nail. "Let's go find your moss." They found it where the woods had grown old and comfortable, where stones lay in a curve that looked like it had always been there, until you noticed the gap where some had gone missing, until you looked close and saw shallow cups cut into their faces like the work of patient hands. Moss ran a soft green beard along the north side, exactly as the thing had said. Briggs paced off 8 steps, slow and honest, and set his badge on the ground at the last toe. "There," he said. "That's the Line Island Force. Can't swear the territory will back me. Can swear I will." Pike did not like hearing no. He especially did not like hearing it from the law when the law had a mustache instead of a ledger. He arrived at the line with 2 Pinkertons and a rolled map. Cane planted in the soft earth like he decided to punish it for being ground and not rug. "You're telling me to bend a rail," he said, smile small and venomless, "because moss grows in a way you find significant." "I'm telling you to bend a rail," Briggs replied, "because if you don't, the earth is likely to bend it for you, and it's less particular where it sets people in the process." Caleb stood off to the side, feeling everything, anger and fear and the stupid, treacherous pinch of hope. He had Eliza beside him, which helped. She slipped her hand around his forearm in that friendly way she had that could steady a man and trip him in the same moment. Pike laughed, the practiced kind. "Superstition. Gentlemen, cut flagstakes at 40 paces past this. Moss." They didn't get to 10. The ground trembled, slow and soft at first, the way a big animal shifts in dreams. Then a root pushed up and curled like a fist, lifting Pike's cane an inch and turning its gold tip to flaky red. One Pinkerton swore and crossed himself, then looked embarrassed about who had seen. The other backed up so fast he nearly sat down. Pike held on to what he had left, pride and a hate of being surprised. "A parlor trick," he said, and something in him chose the wrong tone with the wrong audience. "You can call it what you like," Briggs said, "but you'll call me when your men get swallowed if you don't listen." "What does it want?" Pike snapped, like the question offended him just by being necessary. "Balance," Caleb said before Briggs could answer. Pike turned his head like he had to track down who'd gotten to speak. Caleb held his gaze, hands empty, words the only tools he had. "Put the stones back you took from the old ring. Break the dam at McCabe Bend so the creek runs where it's meant to. Curve the rail 8 steps inside the moss line. No more, no less." "Who told you this?" Pike asked, very soft. Caleb looked at the trees. Pike made a noise like a man finding a pebble in his boot. "You know what wood and stone cost to move?" "Less than a man costs to bury," Briggs said. "Sometimes we pay up front, and sometimes we pay later, but we always pay." They argued until the air got tired of hearing them. In the end, Pike did what men like him do when backed to a place where there's nothing behind but a fall. He called agreement a strategy. "Fine," he said, but it came out brittle. "We'll humor your moss. I'll expect the town's help, stoning, breaking the bend, marking your precious circle, and doing it yesterday." The town came because towns do when the choice is between standing and falling. Children carried little stones like treasure. Women set their jaws and hauled as much as men. Ruth Turner supervised with a rag in her belt, dust on her cheek, and that quiet, endless patience she kept for bread and calves and Samuel's temper. Eliza drew a map from memory and then tossed it aside because the ground itself was clearer. Briggs marked the curve with stakes he cut himself. Samuel Turner swung a sledge at the frozen thick dam his own hands had helped build in a winter that had seemed harmless at the time. When the wall gave and the creek took its breath back, Caleb felt something in his own ribs loosen.